Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU. We are super thrilled to have you here today. My name is Frederick. My pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth's Texas GSA Network Coordinator, and I will be recording today's session, but participants don't need to worry. Only the folks who are presenting are going to be on video, and I'm going to pass it over to E.
Hi everyone, I'm E. I use they, them pronouns. I am the founder of Q Plus EDU, and I'm mostly here to moderate the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. And then also throughout this presentation, if any resources or other information is mentioned, I will be dropping links to those things in the chat. And those links will also be posted on the Q Plus EDU website after this session. So with that, I will turn it over to Joshua.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'll tell you a little more about myself once I start sharing my screen and get started with this presentation. Let's see if I can get this started for us. I'm super excited, a little nervous. It's been a while since I've been on Zoom. I haven't had any classes for a while, so I hope I still remember how to use everything. All right, let's see. Is that working out? Let's see if I have Q&A or someone wants to pipe up and let me know if they can see everything.
Yeah, I can see your screen. That's great.
Excellent. All right, then I guess we can get started. So our topic of conversation today is decolonizing gender and sexuality, the anti-Black roots of queerphobia. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about me. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a student at UCSD, that's University of California, San Diego. I have been working at our resource center for a while, our LGBT resource center. I'm about to go into my second year working there. I really enjoy being able to put to work my passions and my leftist politics and be able to kind of make change on campus. And then I also have my social media handle if you want to follow me, or if you have any questions after the fact or want to contact me or anything like that, feel free to reach out. So I just want to also establish some community guidelines. Luckily, I have Ian Frederick here just in case, there is anything that comes up. But I want to, hopefully we'll have some patience with Zoom in case anything happens, our Wi-Fi cuts out, or also if life happens when we're in e-meetings and things like that. So it's totally fine if you need to hop up and grab some water, or if your cat distracts you for a little bit and you missed something, feel free to ask questions or ask to repeat something if you didn't hear me well enough. So let's just have some patience with Zoom and patience with life, especially right now. Also recognize that we're all coming in with different levels of knowledge about these topics. And this will apply a little more during our Q&A session. We may get questions that may not be worded in the way that we expect or in the way that we would have worded it. But remembering that we're coming in here with good intentions about learning, and respecting that we're all coming in here with different levels of knowledge and confidence about these topics, as well as myself. I don't know that I could feel comfortable ever saying that I'm an expert on these topics, but it's something that I'm deeply passionate about and have been working in for a very long time. So, if there's anything that comes up that you notice that maybe I didn't word well, or if you have something that you want to add on, feel free to let me know about that as well. And also recognizing this as a brave space rather than a safe space. We use this term at work brave space rather than safe space, so that it allows us the chance to have some discomfort. Discomfort is where we're able to experience growth and able to, see where we can challenge ourselves and our own ideas. So calling it a brave space rather than a safe space is really just saying that discomfort may happen, but that's okay. And that we're using this as a learning space. And so it's okay to have discomfort and to feel like you can stretch yourself in the space. And I also wanted to just add a note on accessibility. I tried to, make my slides in a way that will give a pretty broad idea of what I'm talking about. I do have speaker notes that don't necessarily correlate to all the text on the slide. So if there is any issues of accessibility, if the text isn't visible well enough on the screen, or if you can't hear me well enough, or if you need captions in that's better than what I already have on the slides, feel free to let me know, and then we can work to try to find something that works for you. Again, I tried to make this in a very accessible format, but of course, it's not always perfect. So that's all I have for that. But if, again, anything comes up in regards to any of these things, feel free to let me know. Also, I should mention, if you didn't know, that there is going to be a Q&A session at the end of this, just to allow that space for questions and conversation so that we can really delve into these topics. So if you have an immediate question, like, oh, what does that word mean? Or can you repeat that? Feel free to just pop in and ask that. But if they're kind of bigger questions that maybe other people will want to hear our responses or ideas about, if you want to just write them down and save it for the end, or, let me know in the Q&A that, we can wait to answer that. That's great too. So again, immediate stuff, feel free to let me know right away. But if you have kind of bigger questions that would require more of a conversation, then feel free to wait until the end, and that way we can have them all together. Plus, oftentimes if you have that question, other people have that question as well. So today's talk, we're going to talk about how our ideas, and when I say our, I am speaking mostly in terms of America and the American ideas of sex, gender, and sexuality. I know that not everyone may be coming from there, but this is mostly in regards to areas that have been colonized by the West or by Europe. But again, I know this isn't deeply inclusive of, when I say our, that this doesn't necessarily apply to those who have a different idea of sex, gender, and sexuality. I say our more in regards to society. But talking about how our ideas of sex, gender, and sexuality are deeply colonized, and how the queerphobia that we experience today, as well as queerphobia that has built up through time, is rooted in anti-Blackness. And making those connections between capitalism, colonization, and anti-Blackness to give us kind of a broader sense of what do these identities that we hold mean? How do we face queerphobia and anti-Blackness and capitalism all together? Because these things are so deeply tied together, and we'll get into that. We'll talk about some ways that we can make change. And again, we'll have our Q&A at the end so that we can have more of a conversation about these ideas, especially because they are such big ideas. I cannot be a monolith of information. Um, and so I want us to be able to have a dialogue about that. So let's start with a very brief history of capitalism, anti-Blackness, and queerphobia. Um, there is, this could be a conversation that lasts for a very long time and has a million different resources and all sorts of information that gets tied into it. I only have the hour, and so I want to condense this into something that is bite-sized and tangible. So there is a lot that goes into this idea that I may not mention, um, but that is not to say that it's not important to this conversation or that, I've deliberately forgotten about it. I was mostly trying to pare things down so that we can talk about these ideas in, a short amount of time, where we can really start to get a base understanding. So with the birth of capitalism, hand in hand with racism, we saw its direct results being colonization and slavery. So when capitalism found its way into Western societies, Western being the Americas, mostly in Europe, we are seeing slavery arise as well as people colonizing other areas, and that is for the direct result of being profit, that they were attempting to succeed in a capitalist society, and through that, with their racism in hand, they decided that the way to go about that was through slavery and colonization. And we see that the colonization, especially of the Americas and of most of the modern world, with that colonization, we start to see the destruction of those colonized people's cultures, and the spread of European ideas of gender, sex, and sexuality. So these cultures that have been colonized, many of them already have an established and respected idea of what we would consider to be queer people or trans people, or being queer or trans, and these ideas were systematically destroyed to establish the growth of this sort of Western European empire. And so these ideas were systematically destroyed, spreading these European ideas of gender, sex, and sexuality. And so we can see how modern day homophobia and transphobia is rooted in these colonial ideas and rooted in anti-Blackness. So again, big ideas, but to kind of break it down a little bit, it's that the homophobia and transphobia that we see today is coming from these European ideas of queerness and transness being, either unnatural or, whatever their argument is, and how that is because it's coming from these colonial ideas, and because these colonial ideas paired with anti-Blackness resulted in slavery and colonization, how those ideas are then rooted in anti-Blackness as well. So when we see someone who is being, homophobic or transphobic now in modern day, that is not only a disrespect to queer and trans communities now, but also a disrespect to communities who have already had a established and respected idea of being queer or trans. And these words, queer and trans, are, Western English words. So they don't fully encompass the cultural ideas of gender and sexuality and sex that existed in other cultures. However, they're the words that we have to work with right now, especially because with all the cultures that have ever existed, there are a lot of identities and ideas that have to be encompassed. And so recognizing that that language is limiting, but also recognizing that it's the language that we have to, discuss these topics. So this idea, kind of creating a tangent off of that, we see this argument that I wanted to address kind of early on. And this is an argument that we often see, and I didn't write this the best way in my notes. The argument of communities of color that may be more, say, traditional, that we often see homophobia and transphobia in communities of color is also rooted in this colonialism and anti-Blackness as well, because cultures of color oftentimes already had a idea of gender and sex that wasn't westernized, and it has since been destroyed. And with all that comes with colonization, the taking of resources and things like that, we have to acknowledge that there is there's an inhibitor for culture to progress in the same way. So we saw how European cultures were able to now take hold of and steal these resources, including people from other cultures, and then had the resources to be able to make cultural changes and ideological changes, because they didn't have to focus on those more essential needs. The Industrial Revolution, having those resources to make industry is what resulted in the Enlightenment and this idea of progression of culture. And so we can see how colonization also inhibited those cultures whose ideas and stories have been stripped from them, how that also inhibited them from being able to reclaim them and find them again, and reintroduce them into their culture. So I wanted to bring forth this argument just in case, that was something that comes to mind, where sometimes people say, well, I'm seeing homophobia and transphobia maybe in my own community that's a community of color. How do I address that, knowing that homophobia and transphobia comes from anti-Blackness and comes from colonization? And so trying to tie those roots of those cultures back to colonization and seeing how there was that cultural shift of what gender, sex, and sexuality mean within that culture kind of helps us dissect how we then address that within our own communities of color as well. And I haven't been looking at the Q&A. Okay, good. There's no questions so far. I wanted to make sure I had that open as well, just in case something came up and I had just been rambling on and forgetting about a question. So with that, I know that that's kind of a really large idea to think about, considering we have to think between 2020 and the beginning of colonization, um, and consider a lot of different cultures and ideas and challenging the ideas that we currently have present. So I want to again just mention that, questions are highly encouraged. So if you're, just like, hey, can you explain that in a different way, or can you, you know, add on to that? That would be great. So that I'm making sure that everyone is, on board. I'm gonna move on, because someone might be typing up their question right now, but don't feel like you can't ask it. So I want to talk about what we can do to challenge our own internalized biases of anti-Blackness, homophobia, and transphobia, that internalized colonization that may exist in our own minds, how we can challenge those ideas, how we can work on them and make progress, um, especially because racism and the oppression of the queer community is systemic. It can feel really tough to make an impact on that. Um, and that's not to say that there isn't ways to address those changes, but on an individual level, that can often feel really out of reach. And so I wanted to focus on how we can make those impacts on ourselves, how we can work on our own biases, how we can address those for ourselves and kind of work that outwards into our own communities. And I also wanted to include that this is not an exhaustive list, and also that it's important to support in and out of your own communities. So yes, it is important to support and listen to Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you only need to listen to queer and trans people in those communities if you're, queer and trans. Or that, if you are someone who, I'm trying to think of a qualifier. Um, if you're a cat person and you really like cats, that doesn't necessarily mean you only have to listen to, those speakers or those activists that are also in alignment with your ideas in that regard. So it's also important to respect and listen to Black and Indigenous, straight people and cis people on these issues, especially when it's in regards to their own communities. So the cat qualifier wasn't really my best metaphor, but I was, trying to introduce this idea of, yes, we want to listen to people who are more marginalized and also who we can see ourselves in, but it's also important to listen to people just when they're speaking about their own communities, even if we don't have a direct way of relating to them. I just got a question. Let's see. On using our privilege to speak up, what do you find the best way to speak up when someone says something racist or transphobic, etc.? I'm going to get to that in just a moment while I'm going through these points, and then I'll answer that while I am talking about using your privilege. But thank you for that question. So again, not an exhaustive list, but just starting off by listening to Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people. Something that I had to acknowledge was my, I called it my like ratio of content consumption, is recognizing when, a lot of the activists that I'm listening to are maybe um, you know, white people or straight people, or acknowledging that a lot of the YouTubers that I watch are not Black or Indigenous or queer or trans. Um, Looking into the ways that I consume information can it makes a big impact. And so I encourage everyone to evaluate your own content consumption and recognize, oh, the ways that I'm looking for information, who am I looking for that information from? So look to your social media and YouTube. Who are you following? Who are you seeking that information from? It's important to continue to be surrounded by Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people, their ideas, their faces, because it's difficult to address those ideas and those internalized biases when you are not continually being confronted with them. And that includes books, movies, and music. Are you only listening to white bands? Are you listening to white people, or are you watching White People the movie, for the fifth time? Can we encourage some more diversity in there? Um, and also looking within your own community. When you seek information from your own community, are you only listening to, um, you know, non-Black or non-Indigenous people in your community, or straight and cisgender people in your community? And that's not to say that you have to sort of force diversity, but also recognizing when you see that, you're able to then question yourself, oh, why do I usually read books by white authors? I wonder if there's, something I need to work on there. Or, oh, I noticed that I listen to a lot of bands that don't have any queer or trans people in them. I wonder where that's coming from. And that way you're able to find those spots in your mind that kind of either need healing or need to work on. And that can be either when addressing your own internalized biases toward communities you're a part of, but also communities you may not be a part of. I'm going to answer this question. How can we find a balance between increasing consumption and not culturally appropriating, especially when it comes to music? I'm gonna try to answer this, and if anyone else has any ideas, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. Or if I don't answer your question, if I'm not like actually answering it, let me know so that I can make sure I'm answering your question. I think cultural appropriation can often feel like something where it's like, oh, I know it when I see it, rather than a definitive line between what is appreciation and what is appropriation. And so I think recognizing that you are seeking to listen to, you're increasing the diversity of your music so that you can listen to more, brown voices, and have a greater understanding of what music can be beyond, say like this Western idea of what music is. Um, I think trying to keep your mindset there is a really healthy way to do that. Um, I think when it can start to lean into cultural appropriation is when we start to see the fetishization of cultures, in terms of only listening to mostly listening to white music except for this one culture and their music, and really being sort of enthralled by this other culture, um, and not really addressing why it is that you are interested in this other culture that you're not a part of, or understanding the implications behind, you know, treating this culture as a sort of monolith. I think that is a great way to kind of make sure that you're coming from a good place with it. Um, am I answering that question, or is there anything that anyone else feels like I'm maybe leaving out about that conversation? And I know you may be typing. It's always strange having like that silence um, on Zoom, because people are typing, but it still feels strange to have that dead silence. But okay, good. I'm glad. And again, if anyone has anything that they want to add on to that, feel free to type it in. It's it's not an interruption. So again, really evaluating, where do you seek information from, who do you listen to, and giving yourself the opportunity to ask why. Even looking at your dating pool, if you're someone who is old enough to be on Tinder, thinking, who do you swipe right on and why? Is it, usually a certain type of person? I think allowing yourself to feel comfortable knowing that maybe not that it's okay to have these internalized biases, but recognizing that everyone has them and not expecting yourself to be perfect in that way really opens up this ability to be comfortable addressing those ideas as well. Also, educating yourself is a really great way to start. Oftentimes, queer and trans people of color get really exhausted with always answering questions and feeling like, they have to be the resource for everyone and be able to have all the answers to these questions about racism and homophobia and transphobia, etc. And so allowing yourself to be educated, listening to Black and Indigenous queer and trans people so that you can then amplify those voices is really important. Both, understanding it yourself and also amplifying those voices so that you can then be the person that people ask questions and really alleviate, both alleviating people that are marginalized of that responsibility, but also recognizing that sometimes people only listen to a privileged voice. And that's something that I, meant to mention earlier is, why is it me that is having this conversation on anti-Blackness? I want to amplify Black voices and amplify these issues because I know that, a lot of the people in Black, queer, and trans communities are hurting, especially right now, and are exhausted right now. And using my privilege as a non-Black person to say, I'm going to now step up and take over for you. And I'm going to be the messenger for this information so that you can work on healing and taking care of yourself, because I am not in that position right now of having to focus on both healing and taking care of myself and also making this progress within greater communities and educating other people. So educating yourself, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and I'll get to what this link is at the bottom, and I can share it. I don't know if I can share it in the chat. Maybe I can, but I can upload it to the website. Something I'll make it so that it's accessible. But this is a resource that is kind of a master list that I've compiled for myself, but I've also noticed that it's been helpful to other people, but there's a lot of education resources on there as well, just of books that are really great in talking about Black and Indigenous, queer and trans liberation. Also just resources to get more Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people in, your bookshelf, in your movies. So there's a lot of information there, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So then getting into supporting Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people, this can be done financially, and that can be directly, to individual people, and also through purchase. So that can also be, supporting Black businesses, or supporting Black-owned businesses, or supporting, Indigenous and queer and trans-owned businesses as well. I want to kind of boost the idea of normalizing donating to individual people when you are looking into financially supporting people, and not through purchase, rather than going to an organization. Oftentimes when people need help, they know best where that money needs to go, what they need help with. And organizations don't always know how to do that. Organizations also, sometimes need to use those donation funds to work on their own advertising or to pay their own employees. And that's not to say that organizations are bad, or that, crowdfunding or mutual aid is bad, because it's been very effective, especially right now. And, it's still very important, especially if you don't know who to give your money to in terms of individuals. But it's also important to recognize that people have the agency to say, I need money for this, and I know it needs to go to this. And so if you give it to me directly, it will definitely go to this. And it's immediate, rather than donating to an organization and then that person who's in need has to reach out to that organization, has to connect with them, verify their information. They may not get the full amount that you had donated. It's a more arduous process that sometimes doesn't help the people who need it the most. So, when you see that people have a GoFundMe, or leave their information saying, here's my Cash App or Venmo, and I need help so that I can afford rent, or I can afford food, or I want to be able to get this gender affirming surgery. Those are really great opportunities to financially support Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people. So now getting to your question, vocally and using your privilege. I'll answer your question first. What's the best way to speak up when someone says something racist or transphobic, etc.? I wish I had a simple, easy answer, because sometimes it's something so subtle, and they didn't even recognize that it's something that it comes from a root of racism or transphobia, and they just kind of move on with it. Or it can be something that's very direct and made to instigate and made to just cause conflict. I think something that's important, if it's something that's direct, especially if it's directed at someone and their own identity, is to focus on, and this isn't the best wording, so bear with me, but directing your energy to the victim. victim, probably not the best word, but the person who's receiving these comments. You can spend a long time arguing with people who are just instigating and insulting to just cause a ruckus, and the person who received those comments still is not, receiving the care that they need after that. And so instead, focusing on defending that person or that group of people, if it's a direct moment, I think is really important. If it's something that clearly, they didn't recognize that it's as harmful as it is, something that really just like rolled off their tongue or is coming from a place that they're not aware of, I think that's a great opportunity to then, um, if it's a one-on-one, you can be like, oh, hey, just so that doesn't, come from a great place. Maybe you should, you know, try using this um, instead. Or, if it's in a group setting, sometimes that can be intimidating, and maybe, waiting until you can pull that person aside and say, hey, I noticed you said this earlier, just a heads up. Um, or, oftentimes I think it's great, when I notice it, I will sometimes message the person and say like, oh, hey, just so you know, this thing that you tweeted, you probably shouldn't use that word. It's, here's the roots of it, and it's not the best, just so you know. That way, it's not something where they feel like they're being confronted and being challenged. They have the opportunity to take their time with it and educate themselves in that moment. And that's, of course, under the assumption that this person will listen when called in and is open to um, making change. And so sometimes you have to find something in between, and knowing, that person is really helpful, knowing if they're just going to completely brush off whatever you said, or, if they're looking to start an argument, I know is helpful, and unfortunately is not always the case. We don't always know where that person is coming from, or um, what their reaction is going to be if you tell them that something that they said was harmful. Um, but I think kind of using those two ends of the spectrum, you can sometimes find something in the middle of, making sure you're taking care of the person or people who were affected, and also, giving some, education behind why whatever they did or said wasn't, you know, wasn't I don't want to say a healthy response, but like wasn't effective and was harmful. Um, Also, I've been really challenging myself to approach with compassion and empathy. I know for myself, it is sometimes really easy to jump to frustration and irritability when I notice these things, especially when I notice it in my own family, or when I've, heard things that are harmful, a lot during that day. It's easy for me to just want to um, kind of get angry about it. And so I've really been challenging myself to approach it with empathy and recognize that everyone has the agency to do good and to act justly, and recognizing that agency in each person, and that most people really want to be good people and don't want to be harmful. I think it takes some mental energy, but in the end, it's usually far more effective than trying to call someone out or, you know, cancel them, which cancel culture, you know, that's a whole other conversation. So I'm not even gonna get into it. But does that answer your question? Does anyone else have anything they want to add on to that? Anything maybe I didn't mention? Awesome. They said thank you. Cool. So I know we're starting to get to the end of our session, so I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, but I want to say thank you, that you can, again, find me on social media if after the fact you're like, oh, actually, you know, I have this question, or, you know, if something comes up and you're like, you know what, I don't really know who to ask about this, but I remember that one presentation from Joshua, so I know I can message him about it. So feel free to reach out to me, ask your questions. I'm, you know, more than happy to be a resource. Other than that, I want to allow some time for you to think if you have any questions or dialogue that you want to have. Feel free to just pop into the chat. I'll allow some space for it. I wish when it was quiet on Zoom, they would just automatically play like elevator music.
Thank you, Joshua. This was amazing. I feel like the time just flew by. I was like, wait, we're done? Where did an hour go? I had a couple of thoughts when you were talking about cultural appropriation, and I think a lot of the definitions of cultural appropriation that I've read included something about either like profiting off of another culture or passing another culture or another person's ideas or products off as your own. And so I think, especially when we're talking about music, I think, like you said, like if you're just consuming these things without having kind of a thoughtful lens about, you know, like why did I decide that this was the right background song for this TikTok video? Like what, you know, like what are the connections that I'm making between what this artist is saying and what they're, you know, how they're portraying these things with what I'm showing? Like, am I making a joke out of all of the hard work that they've put into their products? And because I think like it's easier to say, oh, you know, like what's this, like Urban Outfitters like selling like Navajo blankets and like that are not actually Navajo and not actually like made by Indigenous people and not giving any money to Indigenous people. Like that's a really easy, clear example of cultural appropriation. But I think for individual people, it can be a lot trickier. So I really appreciate the nuance that you brought into that.
No, and I really appreciate that addition. You know, it is something that is sometimes not very clear to define. So I really appreciate that addition. That is, you know, much more succinct. But yeah, especially if, you know, maybe you are someone who like is a content creator, or, you know, you start to appreciate some sort of style of music or art, and you think, oh, I want to include that into, you know, my own creation. That's something you can then think, oh, well, does this have, you know, a greater cultural meaning that, you know, I'm not acknowledging, and, you know, maybe I should allow that to sit and respect that, in kind of an understanding way, rather than knowing, you know, I'm also going to sell these prints and make the money off of it myself, or, you know, whatever. But I really appreciate that. And I'm
Yeah,
not seeing a whole ton
I
of
think
questions.
like conversations about like open and closed practices are important too. So I'm in like a like witchcraft group on Facebook, and one of the like most awesome things that I've learned is like the difference between like opened and closed practices. And so things like voodoo is a closed spiritual practice, and like if you are not a practitioner of voodoo culturally and like through your heritage and all these things, like you shouldn't have a voodoo doll because that's not for you. It's like smudging and like all of these different like sacred aspects of culture and religion and spirituality that have been um, bastardized by capitalism, um, and like made for consumption. And so just thinking about those kinds of things, like I think brujeria is like really becoming popular and like becoming a word that I hear around. And that's one of those things like that is like if that's not part of your cultural heritage, like you are not a bruja. Like these are really big, important spiritual ideas, and like I don't think that people would um, commodify Christian like spiritual things in the same way. And that's definitely something to think about too.
And I think another facet of the cultural appropriation thing is thinking about like if something is a limited resource, and then if you are commodifying that resource and using it for aesthetic purposes. So, you know, there's been a lot of discourse around the use of like white sage, and that's something that's part of a lot of different like closed Indigenous practices, and then people have been using it for like TikTok videos. And so just thinking about, you know, not only does this have cultural, historical, spiritual significance, and then two, am I taking these resources that there already aren't enough of, and then am I using them just for fun or because I want to experiment with this thing or whatever. And so I think there's a distinction between that and like listening to music. I don't think that music is a limited resource. There's so much of it. And, you know, we make music to be consumed. And it's possible that people have different, I guess, views on this, but, you know, there are styles of music that are traditionally Black. And I don't think anyone has a problem with white people listening to what might be considered Black music, but it does become a problem when white people begin to gatekeep Black people out of certain types of music. And so I think it becomes appropriative, like, for example, with rock and roll, it's a genre of music that is rooted in a lot of different Black cultural traditions and other things, yet Black people are continuously excluded from various aspects of the music industry and from rock music specifically. And so in that instance, it is appropriative because they, you know, white people, I guess, stole these aspects of Black culture that, you know, they liked, they thought were cool and interesting, and they took them and claimed them for whiteness and excluded Black people. And so just considering like the cultural background of things and whether people are excluded from these practices, whether you're respecting the roots of those practices or whatever, is just important in considering the conversation around appropriation. And I think it's always complex. There's never going to be like a hard line between like, this is okay and this isn't, but it is important to consider your intent and other people's intent when consuming products or using products or whatever.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, E. That was, I think, a really important thing to mention, especially when something is a limited resource that, you know, is a very clear indicator of, is this something that I need to consume, or that is something that is sacred to me and my culture personally. I also, while you were talking, I was thinking about how I was reading up on and I wish I had the information in front of me right now, but the person who coined the term cultural appropriation was saying that this term was never meant to be about gatekeeping. It was never meant to be about, well, you know, Black people can do this, but white people can't, or Indigenous people can do this, but Black people or white people can't. It was more about how we recognize in society when we see someone who is not white does something and it becomes demonized or is, you know, outlawed, or, you know, is, you know, in some way thought of as less than. But when we see someone with privilege do it, how it suddenly becomes commodified and trendy, or, is much more popular. And so recognizing that there is an aspect of just respect in saying, I know if I were to do this, that it would be totally okay and people would applaud me for it. But I know if you did it, it would be different. So because of that, I'm going to stand in solidarity with you and I'm not going to do that. And so I think that is a great way to, think back on, is this cultural appropriation? Is it not? Is, revisiting the roots of that term and, seeing, does this apply in that same way? And I have another question here. I'm white and I have a spiritual / magic practice. Should I remove smoke cleansing, Palo Santo, sage from my cleansing rituals? Are there alternatives that are appropriate?
That's a great question. And so as E mentioned, like white sage is actually like really limited and is considered part of the closed practice. If you're on Facebook, the group Sounds Like Bisexual Witchery is the one that I'm part of, and it's amazing. And they have a bunch of different learning units that you have to go through when you join the group in the beginning. And there's a really big one on cultural appropriation, but one of them specifically goes into like smoke cleansing and alternatives to smudging that correspond with different like ethnicities and cultural heritages and practices. And so there are definitely ways to do smoke cleansing that are not culturally appropriative. And so I think, yeah, just understanding the origins of the actual like herbs that you're using and whether those are something that is readily available to everyone, so like lavender, I think, is one of the things that a lot of folks like will cleanse with because it's so readily available and it's not part of a closed practice. Yeah, love that group. But yeah, Joshua, what you were talking about with like one group kind of being able to elevate something that another group is like demonized for made me think about white people with dreadlocks. Like I think was it this year or last year that California passed the like natural hair bill, like finally saying that like Black folks can wear their hair naturally in professional environments and that dress codes can't say that natural Black hairstyles aren't welcome in the workplace. And to think that like white folks who go on vacation in the Caribbean come back with cornrows and go to work and everyone's like, oh, it's so cute. Like those are the kinds of things that are like really, and I know you can find it. I read a really great article yesterday, I think, about the use of emojis and like GIFs as blackface. And like, do you know what I'm talking about?
The Simpsons with the like
Yeah.
yellow neutral skin.
I knew you are so good. E and I have done a lot of Zoom webinars together recently, and they are the absolute monarch of finding resources to put in the chat. So I feel very blessed to have them around. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a much better answer than I could give because I'm not as involved in spiritualism, but that's, and I want to, I'm trying to like get all these ideas out while we're like finishing up, because I'm sure people have other stuff to do, but no, that was a really great way of wording that. And I've had friends that had been using Palo Santo or had been using sage and then realized like, oh, I didn't realize that either this is a closed practice or that even that this plant is endangered because it's being commodified. And so even finding something that's local to your area, like one of my friends, we recommended like, oh, there's a lot of like desert sage that's just native to the area. You can propagate that and grow it yourself. That's another great way to do that. But yeah, also another way of looking at cultural appropriation is, you know, especially when we're thinking about like comedy, I think is a really important thing to think about. Like, we're talking about like emojis and GIFs, and like I see it a lot on like TikTok and stuff, is do I think that this is funny or entertaining because it is a caricature of a certain culture? That's another great way of looking at it, I think. Like, do I think that this is funny because it's, some sort of stereotype that's being portrayed? So I thought that was, another great thing to mention as well. So I know we have to wrap up here. So, if you have any last lingering questions, either get them in quick or feel free to reach out to me on social media. I think, not to make it about me, but that would like make my day if someone was like, I really appreciated your lecture, and so I had this last question. So but in our last few moments, I wanted to go back to this slide, just for last thoughts, that anti-Blackness is a non-Black issue, that it is something that, and I'm going to say we because I'm, speaking about me, that we as, non-Black people have to address, because it's something that we have the power to perpetuate. And that means that we also have the power to dismantle it and help people heal from that. I also wanted to mention this link that is, I started it when the Black Lives Matter movement started to kind of start kicking up again during this summer. Um, I wanted to make a master list of just like resources, because it was easier for me to like understand information when I had it all in one place. And so I started it just like I would compile like the GoFundMe's that I saw, or the petitions that I saw, just so I could like have them all in one place and be able to say like, oh yes, I did see that one and sign that one, or oh no, I haven't seen that one yet. But it also has a huge list of Black-owned businesses. It has a huge list of Black-owned bookstores, so that, if you want to get information about any of these things, that you can then buy them from Black-owned bookstores rather than like from Amazon. And a lot of like books and movies that are either just like great entertainment that just has like better diversity, but also education resources. So I started it for myself, but I've noticed that it's been really helpful for other people. So feel free to use it. I'm constantly just like adding on to it. Whenever I see things, I'll just like bookmark things on Twitter and then like go back through my bookmarks and add them to that. So yeah, feel free to use that. And if you have anything that, if it's like your own business or something that you really want to make sure is on there so that other people see it, feel free to let me know. And then I wanted to finish off with this quote that I actually saw very recently, like in the last couple of days. It says, "It shows up everywhere and requires constant interrogation, unpacking, unlearning, changing language and choices. We all need to be doing better." And this comes from Dana White, who is a speaker and facilitator, and the program officer of True Colors Unite, which is an organization to help out with LGBTQ homelessness. And the quote was originally about fat phobia and colorism, like specifically that was what they were talking about. But I thought it also applied really well to this conversation. And so I thought it was just like a great way to finish it off, that, you know, it was never made to be easy, that it's always going to require work, and that we all can be putting in a little more effort to kind of dismantle these internalized biases. And something that I've had to recognize, especially when you know, during whatever the occasion is, being like, I'm exhausted from doing this work, is understanding that any exhaustion that you feel from fighting for another group is nowhere near the it's never going to be equal to the oppression that they face, or the way that they are dealing with the issues you're fighting against is never it's never going to equate to that. So understanding that it might be, especially at first, it might be really challenging and tiring to challenge yourself and question yourself, but it's worth it, if not just for you, then definitely for all the people that receive that impact. So thank you so much. I've really appreciated having this conversation, and knowing that I get a bunch of people here for an hour to just have this conversation with it. It really, like, this sort of these ideas and this topic, I really enjoy learning more about it and understanding as much as I can. And so it warms my heart to be able to share that knowledge, and also knowing that this is now something that we can continue to have conversations about. So thank you so much for giving me this platform. Thank you so much, E+EDU. Thank you, E. Thank you, Frederick. I really appreciate you both so much for helping facilitate this. And I hope that, I hear from some of the people here soon. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. We very, very much appreciate it. This was awesome. Yeah, for folks who are here in Austin, if you identify as white, Undoing White Supremacy Austin is a great organization. Also, Surge, if you're in other places in the country, SURJ is a great organization doing anti-racism work. And Q+EDU is going to have additional sessions on race and these kinds of intersections. Last week we did a session on harm reduction, and we very briefly touched on the fact that fat phobia is also rooted in anti-Blackness, like you were talking about. And we've got sessions coming up on the prison industrial complex, on immigration, and then other stuff that's less intense, parents as allies, art, all kinds of fun stuff. And E, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, so I dropped links to Showing Up for Racial Justice and Undoing White Supremacy Austin in the chat. I also dropped a link to our feedback form if you'd like to give feedback on this session or any other Q+EDU session. Also, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to just reach out to Joshua directly. And then our next session is tomorrow, and it's called LGBTQIA+ Students Need Parents as Allies Too. It's hosted by some great folks from Informed Parents of Austin, as well as Glisten Austin. And it'll just be a conversation about how parents can support their queer and trans students and advocate for equality within educational systems. So yeah, but thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Joshua, for this great presentation and awesome discussion. But I think that's all.
Thank you.